Hi guys, and welcome back to the channel. It's Hengist here from House of Hengist Comics, and today we're going to look at a Soviet storm, part of Operation Uranus, and we're going to look at the outer battles for Stalingrad, and our real focus is really going to be on the Romanians, how we set the table up, what we're looking at in terms of the history. This is an incredibly difficult operation to re-simulate. It would be too easy just to historically deploy everything in the open and be overrun by tanks. But we wanted to create a game that would effectively test both the Romanian forces and that of the Russians themselves. Our hero is Mikhail Antonovsky, who will be representing and leading it. And this is really an unsung tribute to a lot of the Axis forces who fought on the Russian front, much against their will in many cases, and many were to end up in captivity. We began the game by a typical air battle, which we greatly enjoyed, and we're still rules testing on that. But the outcome was 2 Soviet aircraft shot down, and that basically prevented the Russians having total air superiority. Anyway, the weather was to hamper everything anyway. So what we're really looking at is basically how to recreate the sets themselves, and I'm going to talk about that shortly. But the most important thing to remember on this new year in a wintry period is that a lot of soldiers have to fight in these conditions, and some of these conditions are absolutely abhorrent. During our game, for instance, temperatures we basically got down to -30. Mechanics and equipment was freezing. It was an absolute disaster, but a magnificent game to boot. So what were our aims? How are we going to do it? Well, what we decided to do was, obviously, we found something that was a little bit challenging, a sort of a knoll which was protected by a Romanian company and fought to the last sort of thing, and so that's what we decided to stimulate. The next thing was how difficult to make it. Battles are never fair in these type of situations, but I tried to put some sort of terrain in the table to give the Romanians a fighting chance, and fight they did. The next thing is, how do you set the tables up? Well, we use a very simple system. We use just basically a white cloth, and we use a lot of, you could use salt here, but you've got to be careful with water, but loads and loads of fibre plastic offcuts, which we've basically mixed up. It's highly carcinogenic, no good for us at all, but there you go. And then we deposit basically those materials down, and we try and cover the table so it gives an uneven texture, and we also produce a number of sort of blown sand effects. Obviously we sprinkle the whole site with the snow itself, or the fibre flex, or whatever else you can use, and it seems to work really, really well. Big is good. We like an 8x5, that's our standard table for these sort of games, so there's plenty of room to manoeuvre. It leaves holes, it leaves gaps, it leaves decision making. Then on top of that, we wanted to build something in. An objective was the hospital, and that's what we basically built, and that gave trench saves whilst it was still operational, so they get an additional 6-up save if things went bad for them and they got hit and failed to save and firepower was made and so on. So that was really simple, but that's all part of the Achtung Panzer system, which has a number of more technical, it's for grown-ups the way we call it, it's more historical wargaming. So now let's look at the game itself. So we begin the game, phase 1, the recon in force, which is tanks and cavalry attacking. But before we start, a preliminary bombardment for 3 turns, 1 turn being effectively 10 minutes, is placed on the position that they're about to assault. And confident in this, the Russians then launch ahead with tanks and cavalry and the T-34s on the far left flank. The Romanians sit there nervously looking at the onslaught. Some, in fact, look wide-eyed and terrified. But they hold their nerve, led by the gallant Antonescu. And the weather conditions begin to deteriorate, but they can still fire smoke. On come the T-34s, and then disaster, fail reaction, and run straight into a minefield. Meanwhile, the Aerosans and the BT-7 short supporting guns come forward as well. And then the cavalry begin a launch many assaults that day. Never dismount, either frozen in their saddles or just gung-ho. In the meantime, there's an assault up the centre. But the Romanians again and again managed to pour fire on the enemy, even as the conditions deteriorate. And we dropped to sort of 12-inch range, 12-inch movement. And it even gets down to 6 inches, which is minus 30. If it had been 1 again, there would have been saves for anyone not in cover. And troops have to motivate to move out into the open. So severe are the conditions. Fog lashes, and on come the cavalry, on come the tanks. And again and again and again, the Romanians hold and counterattack with engineers or with whatever they've got. It's been very successful. It's been very traumatic. And at moments, it looks as though the Romanians are going to break. But again, their one I see is there, or their two I see are wicked noble. The T-34s seem somewhat trapped by the minefield, and in fact they see the third one, rather than risk going through it, decides to move, ironically it being a dummy minefield. But again the cavalry come in. They're getting shot to pieces and whittled down and issuing very few casualties. With blizzards now flying about, the conditions are just so appalling. This prevents some fire coming from the artillery on both sides, and so the gods of war really don't see much action at all. Ultimately, every T-34 assaults basically is repelled and defeated. The Romanians hold their nerve in nearly all circumstances, even sustaining air attacks. The hospital comes under intense fire again and again and again. But their trench saves aren't that great, and at the end of the day, that company suffers 50% casualties. But in that process, they've knocked out effectively 10 Soviet tanks. In a sort of last-ditch attempt, the cavalry tried to break through and rejoin the T-34s that have been cut up by the Panzer 35Ts and the three German Panzers, which basically have managed to come on, these having been given to the Romanians and are the only Panzer 3s and 4s that they've got in this sector. The T-34s, having made last-ditch assaults, just seem to bog down or break down or freeze, or something just isn't going right this day. The centre is looking vulnerable, and as I said, they launch one last attack. But again, this fails and falters, and the whole plan is basically scuppered. In the end, it's looking pretty dire, really, for the Russians. They've lost just about every tank they have. And the Romanians are looking gleeful, having only sustained about 40 men as casualties. It's a glorious day for the Romanians. But as one of the commanders said, this is just a pro. So please continue to support us, subscribe, enjoy what we're doing, participate. Any ideas, welcomely received. Wishing you a happy 2017. Best wishes, Hengist and the crew, and may all your dreams come true.